I wanted to give my official take and stance on the current state of Star Wars, but rather than just make fun, and I will make fun, I wanted to tell you why specifically I don't like where we're at and where we're headed. I want to extend an olive branch though to start and mention that I did grow up loving the expanded universe, so it stands to reason that I'm going to have a bias towards it. And even within the expanded universe, there is a ton I disagree with and find pretty stupid. Like Luke Skywalker, spelled with 2 U's, who's an evil clone of Luke Skywalker made from his severed hand that was somehow recovered from Bespin, and cloning the Emperor pretty soon after the Emperor's climactic demise, which undoes a lot of the weight of Anakin's arc and Luke's persuading him back to the light. Kinda like how that also sucks when they did it in Episode 9. And a lot of other stuff. Now, the simple reason this stuff doesn't bug me as much is because of the medium in which it's presented. It's much easier to disregard an obscure novel or a short comic book than a blockbuster film or a TV series that feels like the whole world is watching all at once. That, and there are plenty of incredible stories, characters, and truly unique, inspired ideas that come from a pure love of Star Wars already present in the expanded universe that help offset the weird, over-the-top, cheesy, and straight-up bad ideas. Now, people always say Star Wars fans are the most toxic. This isn't necessarily true. I understand what they mean, but if you think about it for 2 seconds, it becomes abundantly clear why there seems to be so much fighting and hatred within the fandom. First of all, there is no single intellectual property that has as much stuff under its umbrella as Star Wars. It would take you at least a lifetime to read all the books and comics and watch all the shows and movies and play all the games that fall under the name Star Wars. And besides that, when they say the fans are toxic or they say Star Wars fans hate Star Wars, it's like, of course there will be infighting. Even Star Wars itself doesn't agree with itself. Disney versus the EU doesn't agree with itself within itself sometimes. But for Disney, the first warning sign was literally the very first thing they did when they bought Star Wars. It was a huge slap to the face for all lovers of the then current Star Wars, like me. What they did was cancel this. Star Wars 1313 looked like it was going to be a cinematic gaming masterpiece. It was a dark, gritty look at the underworld on Coruscant, which is littered with scum and villainy and brutal bounty hunters that live a cutthroat lifestyle. From what we were able to see, they were pretty far in development, and every Star Wars fan was very excited, but Disney said no, that's too dark. Off to a rocky start, but even still, I was just happy Star Wars was back on a massive scale. Everyone was anticipating the movie. I remember I was working at a movie theater when the first teaser poster for Episode 7 was released, and I'd regularly stop in front of it and just stare at it. I never thought I'd see another Star Wars film in my life, and the very prospect of it made me overwhelmingly happy. But then, we heard that everything we loved was thrown in the trash. The expanded universe was no longer real within the fictional world of Star Wars. They were now legends, which we can assume, like real-life legends, are poorly translated, falsified tall tales, based off of perhaps a grain of truth, if nothing else. And that wasn't cool to take our most beloved stories and characters and make them a fiction within fiction. There's an interview with George Lucas and Kathleen Kennedy that I've always mentioned to people, and it's heartbreaking to watch. I'm finally seeing it get referenced a lot more now. It's where George tells the interviewer that there's an, I quote, treasure trove of books and comics to work with. So George, despite his own vision of where the Star Wars universe should go, intended for these stories to roll over into Disney's hands and be produced into the movies and shows we would see from them. And sure, we catch glimpses. Andor uses Kyle's Briar pistol, Thrawn is fighting Ahsoka, but you can't just put an exterior shell of something, give it a new purpose, identity, and circumstance, and say, hey, here it is. And that's really what Dave Filoni and the other creative leads have been doing for the most part. They say the fans love Thrawn, let's put him in Ahsoka. But that's not Thrawn, man. That's another slap in the face. Them being like, look at how great I am, I gave you Thrawn. I'm pleasing the EU fans and the new fans. It's like the meme, Mom, I want Grand Admiral Thrawn, but we have Grand Admiral Thrawn at home. So the treatment of the expanded universe was, to someone who's cherished it all through their childhood, frankly offensive and disrespectful. It felt from the start like Disney had zero care for the intellectual property they had just acquired. And now that's very clearly true. Beyond them throwing away the old stuff, though, here's what I generally don't like about the new stuff. First of all, now this has been done to death, but I have to start out with the first major thing that Disney released under the Star Wars umbrella, which is of course Episode 7. Now, as I said before, I was excited for this movie. I actually auditioned for it with my friend.
You know, for such a tough girl, you're pretty squeamish.
I was terrible. And I watched it on opening night. When I sat down in that theater and I saw the Lucasfilm logo pop up in its sparkly green, followed by the swell of brass and the yellow Star Wars title, I cried tears of joy in that theater. But by the time the movie was over, I remember walking back to my car with my friend, and it was a long walk. We saw the movie at a pretty sizable local mall, and I had parked at the other end of the mall, so my friend asked me how I liked it. He wasn't a Star Wars fan, so he didn't really care. And I remember I really pondered this question, and I had the time to. The walk back to the car was silent, and I was thinking about it, really genuinely considering it. And we sat down in the car, and I thought some more, and I finally said something like, I didn't really like it. I wasn't hateful, I wasn't reactionary, I wasn't even passionate in any way. It was the verbal equivalent of a shrug. I didn't really like it. And I think that's important to mention because everyone assumes the haters of the new stuff were primed to hate from the start, and that couldn't be farther from the truth. I went from crying tears of joy to not really giving a shit within the span of 2 hours because I was simply genuinely taking in what was unfolding in front of me. I didn't go in thinking I'd hate it. In fact, I was the most excited I'd been in a long time at that premiere. And when I left, I wasn't full of anger, but I was certainly let down, and my excitement for Star Wars was definitely and suddenly suppressed. But okay, now, why didn't I like it? Again, this stuff has been said, but for the sake of argument, I'll break it down from my perspective. As everyone has said before, it's a cheap copy of Episode 4. And it is. They take all the same beats and moments from 4 and put them in the blender with some great CGI, and there's Episode 7. But beyond that, the first thing that doesn't make sense is the very state of the galaxy. The way we left Episode 6, the Empire was overthrown. The rebels cut the head off the chicken. They were celebrating. Of course, they would expect more resistance from the Empire, but what was important is that the tide had majorly turned for the better. And they had a full-fledged Jedi on their side now. Things were looking up. Well, Episode 7 erased all of that, and we were back at square one with slightly different names. The First Order was the Empire, and they had the upper hand against the Resistance, who were the rebels, and they were sneaking around trying to figure out how to put a dent in the First Order. So what on earth happened between Episodes 6 and 7? And I'm sure there's an excuse in some terrible comic book, but that doesn't fix it. The film should stand on its own against the other films. The first specific sequence 7 ripped off from 4 was Ben confronting Vader on the Death Star. In the very first scene of Force Awakens, we see Max von Sydow talking to Kylo Ren. Kylo says, "You're looking old," and Max von Sydow says, "Something far worse has happened to you." That's a very clever way of fusing Ben and Vader's exchange. "Now I am the master, only a master of evil doth," and Ben's earlier line, "He's more machine now than man." So they're just using all the same beats, all the same themes. So Max von Sydow is a poor man's Ben Kenobi that dies after like 60 seconds of screen time. Then of course they stole the hiding vague important information in an Astro Droid bit. They stole Tatooine, it's Jakku. They stole the Death Star, it's Starkiller Base. They stole the Emperor, it's Snoke. But then even they realized they biffed Snoke so hard that they killed Snoke off before we got to even really know what was the deal with him. And they brought in the actual Emperor. Hey, our knockoff wasn't good enough, let's just bring in the real thing. That's awful. That shows you that they clearly had no idea what they were doing story-wise. They had no plan, no concept. They were just making stuff up as they went. No meaning, no purpose, no arc. They just took off. And the order in which they introduced the original cast sort of confirms this in a weird and subtle way. They go almost exactly backwards. They introduce the big three in the first one, then Yoda in the second one, and maybe someone else, I don't really remember. And then Wedge and Lando in the third one. If they were thinking ahead, they would have started with side characters like Wedge and Lando. Then in the second one, we could get a little closer with Han and Leia. And then we could have had our minds blown with Luke kicking butt in the third one. But no, they were just dishing them out thoughtlessly, and by the last movie, they were desperately grabbing at the bottom of the barrel. No shade to Wedge and Lando, I love them, but you get my point. So those movies, they look beautiful, yes, but in terms of any sort of, again, meaningful, memorable story with purpose and feeling and characters you care about on any level and a clear, inciting incident, rising action, and climax, they're awful. They also lack so much creativity where the original and the prequel trilogies were brimming with them. That was a staple. What always cracked me up is the sequels really thought bringing something back that we've already seen but just making it bigger would be really effective and intense for the audience. Starkiller Base, it's the Death Star, but bigger. That space battle at the end of Episode 9, here's a boring CGI space battle again, but it's comically huge this time. How epic! It feels like all those concepts and sequences were thought up by a 9-year-old writing fan fiction with a crayon. So the second main reason I don't like what Disney has done is because it was bad enough they didn't respect the expanded universe, but they also clearly don't respect the original 6 films. The stories they've been telling, the new ones, tread all over the prequels and the original trilogy like they might as well not exist. Stuff like having Obi-Wan and Vader fight in between episodes 3 and 4. But the first problem is the sheer number of lightsaber wielders we have during the time period of the original trilogy. This overabundance of Jedi. Now I get it, everyone wants to make up a Jedi and write for a Jedi and make their self-insert a Jedi, me included, I get it, it's cool, but having a ton doesn't always work for the plot. And now between the Rebels TV show, the Inquisitors, Ahsoka, Fallen Order, and probably a bunch of other stuff I'm not even aware of, there are tons of lightsaber-wielding, Force-sensitive folks running around during the time of the original trilogy. And all these Jedi during the Civil War era feels to me exactly like what I just said, like the writer is inserting their own personal childhood OC into the universe. They're like self-insert version of Luke, which is something we're all guilty of when we're playing with our lightsaber toy in our bedroom at 12 years old or 28 years old. But we don't put it on the big screen, it's just for fun, it's just for us. It stays in the bedroom. My problem with all these people running around with lightsabers during the Civil War is, I think it's clearly important that Luke is the last practicing Jedi in the original trilogy. And Yoda even tells him, "When I die, the last of the Jedi you will be." And in episode 4, Han mentions how he doesn't even believe in the Force. When you take all the stuff we have that now canonically surrounds those movies, it's absurd for someone like Han to straight up not believe in the Force. The short amount of time between the Clone Wars and episode 4 is already sort of awkward, but George did his best, I think, to make it clear, even in the prequels, that the Jedi were small in numbers. They always stressed how there weren't a lot left. Episode 2's title crawl mentions twice how there aren't many Jedi left. They say there's a limited number, they're overwhelmed, and in the same film, Yoda says, "I'll take what Jedi we have left to help you on Geonosis." And we see that when the Jedi are leading clones into battle, it's usually one Jedi for a massive battle, and that massive battle is one of 100 at that very moment, and most of the other battles taking place probably don't have Jedi present because there are none to spare. And throughout the war, Jedi are getting killed in action, and then Order 66 happens. So yeah, they're toast. And that barely gets a pass for me as is, but certainly not with all this other new stuff going down. My other issue with Jedi and Dark Jedi presence during the Civil War is obviously where the heck were these guys during the important battles of the Civil War? Because when you watch the original trilogy, Luke's doing it all by himself. He is their last hope, it's very clear. So where are these other guys? Why aren't they at least acquainted with Luke, or why haven't any of them, at the very least, even heard of each other? And I know I'm going to get a ton of comments telling me why. I've already read 1,000 comments telling me why, but I've still yet to hear or read one good answer. It's bad writing to step on the toes of the source material. And unfortunately, the Clone Wars TV show also does this very same thing with the very existence of Ahsoka. Now, I know Ahsoka was a character George wanted and sort of handed off to Dave Filoni, but her prevalence rose alongside Disney Star Wars. And to be completely honest, I disagree with the very premise that the Jedi Council would put a youngling in the care of a super angsty loose cannon they didn't trust. It seems a little very irresponsible. And I find the idea of Obi-Wan being Anakin's master while Anakin is mentoring Ahsoka a little messy and uncomfortable. Now, I have the same problem with Ahsoka as I do with all of the shows and games that surround the original trilogy. Where is she in the movies? She doesn't exist. That's the only clear and obvious answer to any of this stuff. If she's such an integral part of Anakin's life, and if she knows the core cast of characters so well, why is she never mentioned or seen? I know they have her off fighting at the Siege of Mandalore during episode 3, but let's be honest, the writers knew they had to create some major conflict conveniently really far away from everything going on in episode 3, so there it is, the Siege of Mandalore. It's a lazy, cheap cork on a rather large plot hole. It's like in Avengers, when they ask Captain Marvel, "Where have you been this whole time? Thanos is a big threat." And she's vaguely like, "Well, other stuff's going down really far away from here." It's extremely lazy writing. Maybe fit the character into the pre-established world a little bit better. Now let's take a step back though and just talk about the presence of lightsabers themselves. A long time ago when I went to go see Man of Steel with my family, when it was first in theaters, I remember my aunt said something very astute coming out of it, and it's stuck with me ever since. My mom asked her what she thought of it, and she was like, "It's alright, but there was too much Superman fighting other Superman." You know, how he fights Zod and Zod's minions for like an hour and 15 minutes at the end. And she said there wasn't enough of Superman interacting with mortals or humans, earthlings, or whatever. That dynamic of this godlike being interacting with general folks is what makes Superman interesting. Pitting him against other Supermen or just beings that are of his caliber for too long gets rid of any sense we want to have of Superman as a protector and a savior and a powerful, humbling force. We've got a lot of lightsaber fights in these new shows. A well-placed lightsaber duel in the proper context can be riveting, as we know, just like Spider-Man's showdown with Green Goblin in the first Tobey Maguire Spider-Man, but too many of these sorts of encounters, like in, I don't know, any fairly new Marvel movie where all you do is see 20 superheroes fighting 50 other super beings, and the characters lose their gravitas. We forget their impact on and relationship with the world, with everyday people. We lose the point. To wrap up the whole too many lightsabers thing, I can make another superhero comparison. Speaking of Spider-Man, remember when the next Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movie was really exciting and highly anticipated? Or the first Iron Man, or any superhero movie from the early to mid-2000s? So why aren't superhero movies as exciting nowadays, or at least as anticipated? Because they're a dime a dozen. We're oversaturated with that content. It used to be a rare and exciting treat, and now they're in our face all day. We can't keep up. This is what Disney also did with lightsabers and, frankly, Star Wars in general. Someone wielding a lightsaber used to be a rare, threatening, mystical sight. Such a deadly weapon could only be wielded by someone with incredible superhuman abilities, by a Jedi. The very word Jedi had weight to it. The layperson should be scared just to pick up a lightsaber, and so should be terrified to see someone before them with the proficiency to wield one. And the sight of someone wielding one used to carry that weight. A Jedi on your side was like a guardian angel, and a Jedi or Sith against you was dreadful. That meant your certain demise. But when you see a lightsaber battle in these new shows, it's cheap because they're a dime a dozen. Just like She-Hulk or Thor Love and Thunder. Most of the duels also don't mean anything for the plot. They may as well not have happened. In canon, this is true, Obi-Wan fights General Grievous a total of 9 times. That's absurd. What's the point of 8 of those duels? To put it in perspective, what if Romeo fought Tybalt 5 times in Romeo and Juliet? That would be stupid. At this point, I'll halfway extend an olive branch again and mention that I do write a lot. I've done it from a very young age, and I've done it a lot, so maybe from an amateur writer's perspective, all this stuff seems lazy and annoying, but from a general audience perspective, it gets a pass. And there are a lot of fans that don't mind all the continuity errors and stories treading on other stories, and they say they love the EU and the new stuff, and they put down people for being mad, but I don't think a coherent universe that makes any amount of sense is a lot to ask for. Anyway, moving forward. The last thing I don't like about the new movies and shows is simply the dialogue. I know the prequels got a lot of hate for the dialogue, but I didn't mind it for one simple reason. And this is another thing I've always said and mentioned and tried to explain for years and years. And just months ago, finally I saw someone else saying it, that the prequels are supposed to be a sort of Shakespearean tragedy, an ancient Greek play. Anakin is a tragic hero with an Achilles heel, and the Republic is the fall of Rome. We are watching titans on screen in the prequels. Heroes at their peak that represent an ancient and flourishing time that is separate from the original trilogy culturally. And in fact, most everything in the prequels is beautifully symbolic or referent of ancient Rome and antiquity in general. The pod race is a chariot race, Mace Windu's death is the assassination of Caesar, the droids and the clones during battle represents the fact that Palpatine is literally manufacturing a war. The long-winded, expressive lines and lack of contractions and dialogue is all purposeful and intentional because it sounds like English that's been translated from Greek. And while I'm on the dialogue in the prequels, I also want to mention that Anakin's awkward flirting on Naboo is totally appropriate of a 19-year-old who's had zero experience with women but is so pent up sexually that he's just forcing himself to go for it. In the new stuff, we have scenes and moments like that fight between Vader and Obi-Wan, which a lot of people loved, where Vader's mask gets ripped in half and we have this very melodramatic imagery of Anakin versus Vader. And then Vader says the line, "Anakin is gone, I am what remains." To me, that's an infinitely worse line than "I don't like sand." Being that cognizant and self-aware of the irony of your character and the literary significance of your situation is borderline fourth wall breaking. And the fact that he believes this means that he's still Anakin. He's aware he messed up, and he's still being an edgy emo teenager about it. It's so on the nose, it's so melodramatic, it's so obvious. It's a line a 13-year-old would write. But the fans love it. They'll reference a moment like that and say, "Oh, you say Star Wars is for kids? Well, check this scene out." And then they show you a scene that's absolutely for kids. But again, they love this surface level drama, and there's Also a bizarre phenomenon within a lot of that Star Wars fan base where they approach Star Wars like it's real life history. There was a comment I saw that blew my mind the other day. Some Instagram account had posted the scene from the Ahsoka show where we have young Ahsoka fighting alongside Anakin during the Clone Wars. And the comment under it was something like, wow, seeing a real actor play Ahsoka makes you realize just how young she was when she saw all this bloodshed and death. It's like, dude, it's a TV show. That whole frame of mind is another staple of very young writing. If you started creative writing at a young age, I'm sure you remember the first time you made one of your characters go through something really awful and traumatizing just for the sake of it. And at the time when you were 11, you thought you were really deep. There was another thread I saw, I think last summer, where Filoni confirmed that the old white man on Endor with the big beard was in fact Rex or some other clone trooper from the Clone Wars show, and then everyone got all excited about it as if real historians had just made a massive discovery that changed something significant about our history. And then a week later, he retracted the statement. He's like a kid playing with action figures, pointing to one thing and calling it something else, to fit the narrative of that play session. This is a Red Power Ranger, but right now he's a Sith Lord. Oh wait, never mind, he's back to being a Red Ranger. We've lost the point. Star Wars from an early time was plagued by the lure of consumerism, and at this point it has overtaken it completely. It's often mentioned that even from episode 6 onward, there were things being changed and affected by this shift to sell merchandise. And when I saw episode 6 in the theater last spring or whatever it was for its anniversary, I was a little shocked. I had seen episodes 4 and 5 on the same big screen at the same theater years earlier, and they both looked magnificent, but 6... You could see the blue screen lines around stormtroopers. You could tell when they swapped to a different type of camera. Matte paintings were super easy to spot. There was, I hate to say it, a cheapness to a lot of it. And of course, major conceptual aspects of the film were changed to fit certain kid-friendly standards, like how Endor was supposed to be the homeworld of the Wookiees. And we were going to get this cool fight between Wookiees and stormtroopers, but they swapped the Wookiees for the cute and cuddly Ewoks. Also how Boba Fett had all this potential as a badass in episode 5, and then he gets this premature comical death. Of course, Luke in episode 6 is phenomenal. The speeder bike sequence is awesome, and we get a satisfying end to the Skywalker arc. But that was the beginning of corporate greed taking Star Wars, or as George puts it, the Empire overtaking the Rebellion. But then something beautiful happened in the 90s and into the late 2000s. Writers and artists and designers that all shared a love of Star Wars came out of the woodwork with ideas and stories to tell, and George let them. So even while Star Wars became this massive, money-hungry thing, passion, creativity, and ingenuity was still at its heart. And as I said earlier, we got some beautiful stories out of it. The debate on Star Wars seems to take two sides. There are the expanded universe fans, and then there are the Disney fans. And they both often claim to be George Lucas purists and are always fighting over what he intended. I think it's of course important to note what he intended, as I mentioned earlier, but I think that whole discourse is an overgeneralized and sort of unrealistic way of looking at it. I, for instance, of course, love George's original story about the Skywalker family and a lot of the other stories he helped write, but because I'm an individual who thinks for myself, I don't have to love every single thought he has. For instance, I think Darth Maul served a very cunning and effective purpose in Episode 1, being the sort of striking visual representation of the demonic Sith returning. George does a phenomenal job with imagery, having Anakin and Obi-Wan fight on a planet that bursts with fire, having Luke's black jumpsuit white underneath, and having a shadowy, mysterious, deadly figure that looks like the devil represent the Sith stepping out of the shadows. But I also think that when this happened, he died. He served his purpose and he died, guys. Look at that. He's dead. There's no coming back from that. Robot legs Maul, I can't get behind it. Again, he served a very visually and thematically important purpose, and he killed Qui-Gon, which in effect starts Anakin down his dark path. His character did exactly what it needed to do. It had a purpose. I know people think it's smart writing nowadays to expand on every character down to the minutia of how they like their steak cooked, but for a character like Maul, the less we know about him, the better he is. And then when Anakin, a very dangerous wild card with a lot of anger and hate and fear that the Council doesn't trust at all, is given a Padawan to train as a way of proving himself, that seems really stupid. That's an unbelievably dumb and irresponsible move by the Council, and I don't buy it. Whether George said it or not, I'm sorry, he's wrong there. He's tremendously right about an awful lot, but the man can be wrong. So, like a lot of things in life, I find that I'm on no one's side. I don't prescribe to one train of thought, and I can't pit myself in any predetermined corner, but I think that's okay because that means I'm thinking for myself. I think the last thing I can say is that in general, Star Wars suffers from a quantity over quality problem. And Disney is at the heart of that. I hate to say it, but it's obvious. They do this with everything they own, like all those live-action remakes of their old cartoons. They'll buy up a beloved, iconic intellectual property and then just pump stuff out with its name on top. It's the perfect cash grab for Disney. And that cash grab mindset was unfortunately burgeoning as far back as Episode 6. And now the Star Wars universe is oversaturated with all this stuff. George throwing us into a world with a plethora of novel sights and sounds and references to things that don't exist was purposeful. It wasn't the lightsabers and the spaceships that made us feel like this galaxy was massive. It was simply the subtle references to things. I'm going down to the Tashi station to pick up some power converters. That business on Cato Nemoidia doesn't count. No disintegrations. I made the Kessel run in less than 12 parsecs. The world is built to feel huge because the audience is forced to speculate and wonder about what any of this stuff is or means. So when we start to write concrete conclusions about what all those things are, just like in our world, it starts to feel small. The more we know, the less vast it is. When there are no more unknowns, how are you supposed to wonder about any of it? And suddenly, not surprisingly, the very sense of wonder is gone. And that's what some expanded universe writers and nearly all Disney writers are both perpetrators of. Diminishing the scope of the Star Wars universe by filling in the gaps way too thoroughly, by explaining every little detail. Not for the sake of any greater purpose other than to simply have an explanation. And there is nothing more antithetical to creativity, to storytelling, to world building, to Star Wars than stuff for the sake of stuff.